The routine broke on a Tuesday, the kind of gray, heavy morning where the damp cold seems to bypass skin and settle directly into the bone. At 5:15 a.m., the streetlights were still humming their electric buzz, fighting a losing battle against the thick pre-dawn fog. Simone turned the corner toward the bus stop, her breath visible in short, sharp bursts. She was wearing her work uniform under a thin coat, a light blue dress that had seen too many wash cycles, and a white apron that she bleached religiously every Sunday night. Her sneakers, white canvas worn down to the rubber at the heels, made no sound on the wet pavement. In her hand, she carried the thermos. It was a battered stainless steel vessel, dented on the side, filled with green tea and honey, alongside a warm bun wrapped in foil. This was the ritual. It had been the ritual for 8 months, 6 days a week. She walked to the metal bench where the paint was peeling, expecting to see the familiar hunched shape of the old man she knew only as Mr. Moon. But the bench was empty. The absence hit her harder than the cold. It wasn't just that he wasn't there, it was that his absence felt violent in the quiet street. Usually, he would be sitting with his knees pulled to his chest, wearing that oversized, oil-stained trench coat that looked 3 sizes too big for his shrinking frame. He would look up, his eyes milky with age but sharp with recognition, and give a small, stiff nod. Today, there was only the wet metal of the bench reflecting the orange street lamp. Simone stopped, the foil-wrapped bun crinkling in her grip. She looked left, down the alleyway where he sometimes slept if the wind was too high, and then right, toward the 24-hour gas station. Nothing. A dread, heavy and irrational, settled in her stomach. In a city of 3 million people, a homeless man disappearing shouldn't have felt like a seismic event, but for Simone, Mr. Moon was the only constant in a life defined by instability. She stood there for 3 full minutes, risking being late for her shift, waiting for a shuffle of footsteps that never came. Finally, she placed the bun on the bench, just in case, and ran toward the bus, the thermos sloshing rhythmically against her side, the sound of liquid marking time against her rising panic. To understand the panic, you have to understand the economy of Simone's life. She was 22 years old, living in a studio apartment where the radiator clanked like a dying engine and the rent ate 70% of her monthly income. She worked at a diner called The Griddle, a place that smelled permanently of bacon grease and floor cleaner. Her life was a series of calculations. How many minutes until the bus, how many dollars until payday, how many hours of sleep she could sacrifice before her body simply shut down. She had no safety net, no family cushion to fall back on. Her mother had passed 2 years ago, leaving behind nothing but a stack of medical bills that Simone was still chipping away at, $20 at a time. In this landscape of relentless subtraction, Mr. Moon was the only addition. It had started by accident. One morning, running early, she had tripped near the bus stop, spilling the contents of her bag. Mr. Moon, who she had previously ignored like everyone else in the city, had silently moved from his bench to help her gather her scattered change. He didn't ask for any of it. He just handed her the quarters with a dignity that seemed out of place for a man whose shoes were held together with duct tape. The next day, she brought him breakfast. It wasn't charity, it was an exchange of acknowledgement. Over the months, the exchange grew. He never said much. His English was fragmented, broken by a harsh cough, but he listened. He knew which customers tipped poorly. He knew when her landlord was threatening eviction. He became a silent witness to her struggle, a grandfather figure stripped of authority, but rich in presence. He would take the tea with shaking hands, bow his head slightly, and whisper, "Thank you, Miss Simone. You possess a good heart. The wind will change." That phrase, "the wind will change," became a mantra she didn't know she needed. But on that Tuesday, the wind didn't change. It just got colder. Simone's shift at the Griddle was a blur of dropped forks and impatient customers. She moved on autopilot, the white apron catching stains she didn't have the energy to care about. Every time the door chimed, she looked up, half expecting to see him standing there, maybe needing help, maybe finally asking for something real. But it was just the lunch rush, a sea of faces demanding coffee refills and complaining about the toast. Her boss, A thick-necked man named Carl, who measured human value in table turnover rates, snapped his fingers at her twice. Simone, table 4 is waiting. Stop daydreaming. She nodded, swallowing the lump in her throat. She couldn't explain that she wasn't daydreaming. She was mourning a ghost who wasn't even confirmed dead yet. That afternoon, she walked back to the bus stop. The bun she had left on the bench was gone, but so was the foil. A squirrel or a pigeon, not a man. Mr. Moon hadn't come back. By Thursday, the dread had turned into a sickening certainty. Simone had asked the gas station clerk, a bored teenager who barely looked up from his phone. The old Asian guy? Haven't seen him. Maybe the cops swept him. They did a sweep on 4th Street last week, a sweep. The word tasted like metal. It implied debris, trash, things to be discarded. Mr. Moon wasn't debris. She checked the local shelters, calling during her 10-minute breaks, her voice trembling as she described him. He's about 70, maybe older. Korean. He has a scar on his left eyebrow, and he walks with a limp. No one had seen him. It was as if he had evaporated. The city was good at that, swallowing the people who didn't have keys to a front door. That night, Simone came home to her apartment building, a brick block that smelled of boiled cabbage and damp drywall. She was exhausted, her feet throbbing in the worn sneakers. She unlocked her mailbox, expecting the usual assortment of final notice envelopes. Instead, it was empty. That was almost worse. It felt like the world had stopped communicating with her entirely. She climbed the 3 flights of stairs, the light blue dress clinging uncomfortably to her back. She unlocked her door, stepping into the small sanctuary of her room. She boiled water for ramen, the cheapest meal she could make, and sat by the window. She looked down at the street below. A black SUV was parked across the street. It was sleek, polished, and terrifyingly out of place in a neighborhood where most cars had mismatched bumpers. The engine was running, the taillights glowing like red eyes in the dark. She watched it for a long time, the hairs on her arms standing up. Paranoia whispered that it was about the debt, that the collection agencies had escalated from letters to physical intimidation. She closed the blinds, her heart hammering against her ribs. The knock came 20 minutes later. It wasn't a landlord's aggressive pounding or a neighbor's casual rap. It was 3 distinct, heavy knocks. Controlled. Authoritative. Simone froze, the fork halfway to her mouth. She set the bowl down on the wobbly table. Silence stretched, thick and suffocating. Then the knock came again. 3 more times. Same rhythm. She walked to the door, her sneakers squeaking softly on the linoleum. She didn't have a peephole, it had been painted over years ago. "Who is it?" she asked, her voice sounding smaller than she intended. "Miss Simone," gently. A deep voice, male, accented but precise. "Not the landlord. Not the police." "Who is asking?" she countered, trying to summon the toughness she used on drunk customers at 2 a.m. "My name is Taesung. I wish to speak with you regarding the man at the bus stop." The lock clicked. Simone opened the door just a crack, keeping the chain fastened. The hallway light was dim, flickering with a dying bulb, but it was enough to see the man standing there. He was tall, dressed in a suit that cost more than her entire building. His hair was slicked back, his face hard and angular, like it had been carved from granite. Behind him, 2 other men stood in the shadows, their hands clasped in front of them, their posture rigid. This wasn't a collection agency. This was something far more dangerous. The man in the front, Taesung, looked at her through the crack. His eyes were cold, assessing, but there was a flicker of something else in them. Desperation? "You are the woman in the blue dress," he said. It wasn't a question. "You are the one who brings him bread." Simone gripped the doorframe, her knuckles turning white. "Where is he?" she demanded, surprising herself. "What did you do to him?" Taesung blinked, the mask of authority slipping for a fraction of a second. He looked at the chain lock, then back at her eyes. "I have not done anything to him, Miss Simone. I have spent 10 years looking for him." He reached into his immaculate suit jacket. Simone flinched, ready to slam the door. But he pulled out a photograph. He held it up to the crack. It was an old photo, black and white. It showed a younger version of Mr. Moon, Mr. Moon in a sharp tuxedo, standing next to a young boy who looked exactly like the man standing in her hallway. "He is not just a homeless man," Taesung said, his voice lowering to a rumble that vibrated through the door. "He is the head of the Cheonse family. He is my father. And I believe you are the last person to see him alive." The air in the hallway seemed to drop 10 degrees. Simone looked at the photo, then at the man. The resemblance was undeniable. The scar on the eyebrow was there in the photo, fresh and jagged. "If you want to help him," Taesung said, "you will open this door." Please, the please sounded unnatural, like a word he hadn't used in a decade, but it was the thing that made Simone undo the chain. Taesung stepped into the apartment, and the space immediately felt smaller. The room was only 200 square feet, a box of peeling beige paint and scuffed linoleum, but his presence sucked the oxygen out of it. He didn't look around with judgment. He looked with a tactical, sweeping gaze that cataloged the exits and the threats. There were no threats here, only poverty. He motioned for his men to stay in the hallway, closing the door with a click that sounded final. Simone stood by the kitchenette, her arms crossed over her apron, a defensive barrier against the sudden intrusion of wealth into her world of scarcity. She offered him the only chair she had, a folding metal one she'd salvaged from a curb, but he remained standing. He seemed too large for the room, his shoulders brushing against the hanging pot rack. The smell of boiling ramen water hung in the air, a humble, salty fog that clashed with the scent of his cologne, something expensive, like cedar and cold rain. "You asked about the stories," Simone said, breaking the silence. Her voice was steady, though her hands were shaking where he couldn't see them. "Mr. Moon told me stories about tigers chasing him. I thought it was the dementia. I thought he was talking about nightmares." Taesung walked to the window, peering through the blinds at the street below where his armored convoy waited. "They were not nightmares, Miss Simone. They were history. My father built an empire in Seoul. When the rivals, the tigers, came for the family, he took the blame for a crime he did not commit to save me. He went to prison, and when he came out, he refused to return to the life. He said his honor was broken. He vanished 4 years ago." Taesung turned back to her, his face a mask of controlled grief. "I have hired detectives, private intelligence, police. No one could find him because he did not want to be found. He wanted to be invisible. But you saw him." Simone looked at the half-empty bowl of noodles. The pieces were clicking together. The way Mr. Moon held his teacup with 2 hands, the way he never slumped even when he was sleeping on concrete. It wasn't madness, it was discipline. "He talked about a garden," Simone said suddenly. "He said the concrete here is too hard, not like the garden where the stone turtle sleeps. He said he needed to apologize to the turtle." She looked up at Taesung. "Does that mean anything to you?" "Because last week he was agitated. He kept saying the date was coming." Taesung's eyes widened, the first crack in his armor. "The stone turtle," he whispered. "It is the statue at his wife's grave. My mother. She is buried here in the city, at the old distinct cemetery on the hill. Today is the 10th anniversary of her death." The realization hit both of them at once. He wasn't gone because he was dead. He was gone because he was on a pilgrimage he was too frail to make. The ride to the cemetery was a blur of motion that felt disconnected from reality. Simone sat in the back of the SUV, the leather seat soft and warm beneath her tired legs. It was a luxury she couldn't enjoy. Her mind was racing. Taesung sat opposite her, speaking rapidly into a phone in Korean, his voice barking orders that Simone couldn't understand, though the tone of panic was universal. Outside the tinted windows, the city flashed by, the neon signs of pawn shops, the blurred faces of people waiting for buses, the world she usually walked through now reduced to scenery. She felt like an imposter in this vehicle, a waitress in a stained apron caught in the orbit of a dark sun. She looked down at her hands, red and chapped from the diner's harsh soap. These hands had fed a king in exile for 8 months, and she hadn't known. When they arrived at the cemetery, the gates were locked. It was past midnight, the grounds shrouded in a heavy mist that rolled off the river. The driver killed the engine. Taesung didn't wait for a gatekeeper. He stepped out, his men flanking him, and moved toward the pedestrian entrance with a force that suggested he would tear the iron bars apart if necessary. One of the bodyguards produced a tool, and with a sharp metallic snap, the lock gave way. They moved inside, flashlights cutting through the fog like lightsabers. Simone followed, her sneakers slipping on the wet grass. "The Korean section is to the north," Taesung said, his voice tight. They marched in a phalanx, the beams of light sweeping over headstones. Simone's heart hammered against her ribs. She was the compass here. She was the one who knew his limp, his speed, his stamina. "He couldn't have walked this far," she said breathlessly. "Not with his hip. He would have stopped." They found him not at the grave, but 100 yards short of it. The flashlight beam caught the reflective strip of a discarded shoe first. Then, the bundle of rags. Mr. Moon was curled at the base of a large oak tree, shivering violently. He had tried to crawl the last distance and failed. The tiger of Seoul, the patriarch of a dynasty, was lying in the mud, clutching a withered flower he must have scavenged from a trash can. Taesung let out a sound that was half gasp, half sob. He fell to his knees, disregarding the mud that ruined his suit, and scooped the old man's head into his lap. "A boji," he whispered. "Father." Mr. Moon's eyes fluttered open, unfocused and glassy. He looked at his son, then past him, until his gaze locked on Simone standing in the light. A small, trembling smile touched his lips. "The tea," he wheezed. "Is it tea time?" The crisis shifted from discovery to survival in seconds. Mr. Moon's skin was burning, his breathing shallow and rattling. Pneumonia or worse. The bodyguards moved to lift him, but he cried out in pain. "Careful." Simone snapped, stepping forward and pushing a large man in a suit aside. "His hip is fused." "You can't lift him by the legs." The bodyguard looked at Taesung for permission to shove her back, but Taesung nodded at her. "Do what she says." Simone took charge, her waitress instincts kicking in, managing chaos, prioritizing tasks. "Support the neck. Lift from the waist. Keep him flat." They rushed him back to the SUV, the vehicle transforming into a makeshift ambulance as they sped toward the nearest hospital. It wasn't the private clinic Taesung wanted. There wasn't time. It was City General, the same underfunded, overcrowded public hospital where Simone's mother had died waiting for a specialist. The waiting room was a war zone of coughing patients, crying children, and flickering fluorescent lights. When the group burst in, a half-conscious homeless man carried by men in Italian suits, the room went silent. They approached the triage desk. The nurse, a woman with tired eyes and a clipboard that she wielded like a shield, didn't look up. "Name? Insurance? If he's indigent, he waits in row C." Taesung slammed his hand on the counter, the sound cracking like a gunshot. "He is dying. He needs a doctor now." The nurse looked up, unimpressed by the display of testosterone. "Sir, everyone here is sick. Take a number." Taesung's face darkened, his hand moving inside his jacket, a gesture of habitual violence that made his bodyguards tense up. He was about to buy the hospital or burn it down. "Stop," Simone said. Her voice wasn't loud, but it was clear, cutting through the testosterone and the bureaucracy. She stepped between the Mafia boss and the nurse. She didn't look like power. She looked like the neighborhood. She looked like the nurse's cousin or sister. She leaned over the counter, meeting the nurse's eyes. "His name is Moon. He isn't a drunk, and he isn't an overdose. He has severe hypothermia and a history of hip surgery. He walks to the bus stop every day at 5 a.m. to make sure I get to work safe. He's a grandfather." She paused, her voice trembling with a righteous fatigue. "We are not asking for a favor. We are asking you to look at him. Please." The nurse looked at Simone, then at the shivering old man, and finally saw the human being beneath the grime. The shield lowered. "Trauma room 2, she said, typing a code into the door. "Get him back there. I'll page the resident." Hours later, the hallway was quiet. Mr. Moon was stable, hooked up to monitors that beeped with a reassuring rhythm. He was clean, warm, and sleeping. Taesung sat on a plastic chair outside the room, his head in his hands. He looked stripped of his aura, just a son who had almost been too late. Simone sat across from him, sipping a cup of vending machine coffee that tasted like burnt rubber. She felt the adrenaline crashing, leaving her hollowed out. Taesung stood up and walked over to her. He didn't bow, that would have been too formal, but he stood with a posture of absolute deference. I offered the doctors $10,000 to hurry, he said quietly. They looked at me with fear. You offered them the truth, and they looked at him with care. He paused, looking at her worn sneakers. You have done what my money could not. You kept him alive. I just gave him breakfast, Simone said, shrugging, uncomfortable with the praise. He was hungry, Taesung shook his head.
No.
You gave him dignity. That is what starving men truly crave. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a plain white envelope. It wasn't thick. It didn't look like a movie payoff. He held it out. This is not payment. Payment implies a transaction, and what you did was not a transaction. This is a balance restoration. Simone hesitated. She wanted to refuse, to say she did it for free, but she thought of the eviction notices, the medical debt, the radiator that didn't work. Pride was a luxury she couldn't afford. She took the envelope. It felt heavy, dense. Thank you, she whispered.
He's a good man.
He tells good stories, Taesung smiled, a genuine expression that transformed his harsh face. He wakes up in an hour. He will want to see you before we go. 2 weeks later, the routine was back, but the rhythm had changed. The bench at the bus stop was empty, but it didn't feel haunted anymore. It felt retired. Simone walked to the stop at 5:15 a.m., the air still cold, the streetlights still buzzing. She wore a new coat, warm, wool, navy blue, and sturdy boots that gripped the pavement. The envelope had contained enough to clear her mother's medical bills and prepay her rent for a year. There was no fortune, no island getaway, just the profound, quiet freedom of being at zero instead of in the negative. She still worked at the griddle. She liked the regulars too much to leave yet. As she waited for the bus, a black sedan pulled up to the curb. It wasn't the convoy, just a single car. The window rolled down. It was Taesung's driver. He didn't say a word. He simply reached out and handed her a thermos. It was new, high quality, the kind that kept heat for 24 hours. Simone took it, feeling the weight. Engraved on the side were 3 small words. The wind changed. She unscrewed the cap. Inside, steaming and fragrant, was hot green tea with honey. She took a sip, the warmth spreading through her chest as the bus rounded the corner. She wasn't saving anyone today. Today she was just going to work. But as she boarded the bus, she looked back at the bench one last time, smiled, and finally, truly, let him go.